my research investigated, well, 5 tax systems. I do know that superannuation guarantee is not effectively a tax system, but it falls in line with PAYG withholding. And so the reason that I focused on these 5 systems is because prior literature from 1995 by McKercher, which also investigated small business owner tax knowledge, focused on tax systems that have been replaced with the 5 that are on the board. Those taxes were pay-as-you-earn, fringe benefit tax, which is still in force, wholesale sales tax, income tax, and superannuation guarantee. The research project is also informed by research by Chardin, who created a literacy score for individuals, Australian individuals, in relation to income tax. So the reason that I researched small business is because they are important contributors in the economy. Overall, they are responsible for 98% of all private sector business registrations, and they employ 4.8 million people and contribute 34.7% of income to the measure of gross value added. Now, the reason I use gross value added is because I'm looking at industry sectors. And I specifically was researching this service sector. So small business service sector businesses employed almost 4.1 million people, and their contribution to the economy is $349 billion. So the research project used or collected data from small businesses earning $10 million or less and employing 20 or less full-time employees. And we collected data using a survey of small service sector businesses throughout Australia between the period of the 1st of October 2018 to the 30th of June 2019. So as Brett often tells me to put in the paper, was before any effects of COVID, right? And the research was, or the survey was informed by prior parts of the project, which included a case study of 17 small service sector businesses and also interviews with 23 small business experts. Now, those experts were from areas of government and ATO, accountants and financial advisors, small business academics and small business advocates. So there were in total 5 from each group, except for accountants and financial advisors, where there were 8. The survey was distributed by a variety of different methods, using both all of our personal and professional contacts, also by industry associations and representatives of professional bodies. And we also did a stratified sample of businesses using the ABN register. Now, that sample predominantly looked at states and territories outside of Queensland, because we did believe that we had sort of saturated the Queensland market, considering all the researchers in the project were in Queensland. In total, from the research, we had 259 respondents access the survey. However, only 116 of those completed the survey in totality, which is a disappointing result, we know. And I mentioned my limitations later, but I was lucky that I had 2 prior data collection methods to be able to rely on, and just not relying on the survey. So we collected demographic information relating to the service small business owner themselves, the service sector business, their sources of advice, and what tax systems they were obligated or complied with that were relevant to the research. From these questions, we also were able to determine an actual literacy of service small business owners. In other words, we had 43 different questions in the survey to try and work out what their literacy was. And literacy wasn't solely about business taxes. So we measured literacy in determining or understanding financial statements, in use and understanding of computer accounting software systems, and also in business taxes. And from those questions, we created a literacy score. So there was a business tax literacy score, a financial statement literacy score, a computer accounting software literacy score, And combining all of those, we then had an overall literacy score. For the rest of this discussion, I'm really just going to talk about the business tax literacy score. So I'm going to skip that one. Which you probably can't read any of this because it's so small, but there were 26 tax literacy questions in total. 4 questions related to the topics or the laws of superannuation guarantee, goods and services tax and fringe benefit tax. There were 3 for pay-as-you-go withholding and 11 for income tax. So those questions related to for things like superannuation guarantee was about the rate, when the obligation is payable for adults, whether it's tax deductible, what the earnings is, what superannuation guarantee is calculated on and what type of earnings. For goods and services tax, I looked at what the minimum purchase is when a tax invoice needs to be retained, the registration threshold, whether GST inclusive or exclusive is displayed in Australia, and determining what the GST amount is in a taxable supply. For fringe benefits, I looked at benefits to associates, car benefits, meals provided by employers, and the FBT year, whether small business owners recognised that it had a different year to the income tax year. Pay-as-you-go withholding was related to whether pay-as-you-go withholding and payroll tax are the same tax system, what the registration requirements are once you start employing or employing people, and whether PAG withholding was payable to contractors. And finally, for income tax, the topics related to what the discount is for individuals for capital gains tax, depreciation, claiming deductions for operating a business at home, dealing with GST when working in the income tax regime, deductions for clothing, offsets, pay-as-you-go instalments, the small business tax rate, and record keeping. So we also looked at what businesses were complying with which tax system. We're not going to go into that to detail, but obviously fringe benefits tax had the lowest tax compliance obligations, with only 20 of the 116 businesses complying for FBT. So from these questions, we created literacy scores for each of the tax systems, or a mean literacy score. So it can be shown on the slide that pay-as-you-go withholding had the lowest tax literacy, with only 33.3% answering correctly of the 3 questions that were posed. So 1 in 3 was the mean. The next lowest was superannuation guarantee, and surprisingly, FBT was the 3rd highest literacy. Considering only 20 people or 20 businesses were complying with FBT, it was surprising to see that it didn't have the lowest literacy. Small business owners, however, did appear to have the highest literacy in goods and services tax. We concluded that would be more likely related to the regularity of dealing with transactions in the GST regime. And what we can see from the results is that overall small business tax literacy on average is 42%. So regardless of the tax system or the overall business tax literacy, none of the mean scores show us that people in general have average tax literacy. It's all below average. So these literacy scores, and this is where the prior research by Chardon is really appropriate here, were then grouped into categories of poor, low, basic, medium and high. Now these categories predominantly, each group was in values of 5 questions or 5 correct answers, except for high, because we obviously had 26 questions, so I couldn't evenly distribute those. So, and then from those scoring categories, I then use the overall business tax literacy score to categorise them into those groups. The sorting of those shows that the highest portion of small business owners have poor tax literacy, which means they were correctly answering between 1 and 5 questions of 26 correctly. It also shows us that more than half of the small business owners had poor or low literacy. Those that recorded a high literacy were 12.9% of the owners, which means that they achieved a literacy score of 77% or better. We then compared the overall literacy score to the demographic information. So some of this is in relation to the individual and some of them are in relation to the businesses that they're operating. So we looked at resident small business owners compared to migrants, and the results suggest that those with the highest literacy are migrants that have been living in Australia for 10 to 15 years. This was followed by those that were born in Australia, and what we did find that those with the lowest literacy are those people that have only been here have been in Australia for less than 5 years. Business tax literacy was then compared to education of the small business owners. So those with a postgraduate degree were able to, the mean literacy was just below 50%, with 12.26 meaning that they answered correctly just over 12 of the 26 tax literacy questions. Those that had a education level of year 12 were only just in the low literacy category because they were just over 5 with a literacy mean score of 6.63. And when we looked at undergraduate and TAFE qualified small business owners, there was only a marginal difference. So 84% of the TAFE qualified small business owners were in the basic or low literacy category, and for undergraduate education, it was 70% that were in the basic or low literacy category.
You've got 5 minutes.
Really? It's all right. I've got 2 pages. Okay, and then we looked at business structure, and what did I go too far? Yeah. Okay, business structure. So businesses that were a combination of companies and trust had the highest literacy. So in this group, they actually achieved more than 50% at 55%. This was followed by those that were registered as a company and then by a trust, with all 3 of those types of entities managing to be slightly above average. However, for partnerships, they were low literacy at 10.5 out of 26, or 10.5 as a mean literacy score, whereas sole traders had also low literacy, but their mean literacy score was 7. Business age was interesting. For those that had been operating between 2 and 5 years and above 10 years, they had basic tax literacy. Those with the highest tax literacy were those operating for more than 10 years with a mean literacy score of 13.15. This could suggest what we had found in prior literature, that small business owners retain and build their knowledge over time. So that supports that in some way. But it still suggests that they're only really achieving 1 in every 2 questions correctly, or answering 1 in every 2 questions correctly. Comparison was then made to the number of employees that small business owners employ. Those businesses with 6 or more employees on average have medium tax literacy. For those that are employing between 1 and 5 employees, they have basic literacy, and those who are non-employing have low literacy, which is unsurprising because they often will not be dealing with as many tax systems. Comparison was then made to our ANZSIC, or Australian New Zealand Standard Industrial Category categorisation, to determine what industries had lower literacy. So low or poor literacy was found in a combination of food, information, media and telecommunications, administrative support, arts and recreation, healthcare and social justice. The industry category with the highest literacy was category M, which is professional, scientific and technical services. So most of the small business owners were achieving medium or high literacy in this category, but it should be acknowledged that this category includes professionals like accountants and tax advisors. Okay. And finally, before I get to our limitations, we also looked at or compared these literacy scores to who enters into a payment plan with the ATO. So those with the highest tax literacy score had entered into a payment plan with the ATO on one or more occasions. That's what we found. So limitations that we are very aware of is there was an overrepresentation of participants from the ANZIC category of M, professional, scientific and technical services. Also those with a tertiary education compared to those completing secondary education as their highest level. Our sample size is also obviously one of our limitations. It's very small. However, I was lucky that I had qualitative research in the same project to support that. And also very aware that the questions that we were posing are based on sensitive financial and tax information. So there's a possibility that participants may portray their ability or knowledge at a higher scale than that of reality. That's all from me today. Thank you.